What's good? It's Woog. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. Vasyl Lomachenko, 14-1, puts his WBA and WBO belts on the line in a title unification match versus Teofimo Lopez, 15-1, with Lopez's IBF title on the line. This is a damn fun fight, guys. It's almost one of those matchups that seems too good and too fun to be pulled off in a sport like boxing. Given how this normally works, I'm surprised that both Loma and Teo didn't continue fighting other opponents for the next 2 to 3 years while negotiating, leveraging, and building anticipation. And that's because, luckily, we've got perhaps the two best lightweights fighting under the same promotion, Bob Arum, Top Rank. Certain divisions are really working out for Top Rank, others not so much. But we've got a really good thing going here, so let's not take it for granted. You've got arguably the greatest from featherweight 126 to lightweight 125 of the past decade versus perhaps the most charismatic young fighter in the sport who also happens to have enormous punching power. It's electric. For UFC fans, this is kind of the Khabib Nurmagomedov versus Justin Gaethje matchup of boxing in terms of the quality of matchup and the top tier talent that you're getting here. Lomachenko has pretty much been a top 5 pound for pound fighter for the past 4 years, although his talent and performance levels could have merited that ranking much earlier. Basically, from his third pro fight on, that fight being a hugely impressive win versus arguably the fastest hands in the sport, Gary Russell Jr., I was stunned, especially because Lomachenko had just lost his second pro fight just before that, his only loss to this day, which was against the aggressive, take 3 punches to give 5 tough guy Orlando Salido. Salido won a fair decision, although Loma did rally back and hurt him late in the fight, and you just had this sense that that setback would be very, very temporary and that this Lomachenko guy was destined to do some good things in the future. How good? I didn't think he was going to be arguably the pound for pound king. I didn't think that he wouldn't lose another fight for at least the next 6 years, winning titles in 3 divisions. But his legendary amateur background, including 2 Olympic gold medals, and his obvious talent were just tough to ignore. I thought that he was going to run into a wall by facing Nicholas Walters. That's the guy who stopped a one-time pound-for-pound top 10 Nonito Donaire at 130. Walters was an undefeated, long-armed, hard-hitting, feared fighter when he fought Lomachenko. His nickname is the Axe Murderer. Lomachenko not only took him to school round after round, but got Walters to quit on the stool after the 7th. I was just as stunned then as I was when he outboxed Gary Russell Jr. So the Walters fight was stopped between rounds, and in each of Lomachenko's next 3 fights, his opponents would also quit between rounds. Jason Sosa, Miguel Mariaga, and former pound-for-pound elite Guillermo Rigondeaux, who, in fairness, jumped 2 weight classes to challenge Lomachenko. Usually a bad idea. Ask Kell Brook after fighting Triple G. Ask Amir Khan after fighting Canelo, and that was just 1 weight class. Ask Adrian Broner after fighting Marcos Maidana in his 147-pound debut, leapfrogging 140 along the way. Guillermo Rigondeaux didn't have any business in the ring with Lomachenko, especially that late in his career. You're going to fight a much younger fighter, bigger fighter, up a couple weight classes. But the point remains, Loma made 4 consecutive opponents quit on the stool. He doesn't have devastating one-punch knockout power, although he did versus Roman Rocky Martinez in 2016, just before the Nicholas Walters fight, where he captured the 130-pound title versus Martinez, and in the one-punch knockout versus Anthony Crolla much more recently. But what Lomachenko does more often than not is surgically defangs his opponent and then goes to work on them with angles, footwork, and volume that have them looking like they're surrounded. Him and his opponents look like they're moving on 2 completely different operating systems. Not that Lomachenko's significantly quicker with any one punch, although he is a tremendous athlete. I mean, if you look at this guy's workouts, this guy's walking on his hands, and he's like hitting a moving tennis ball in rhythm. I mean, you see people working the speed bags and doing different drills, but if you look at how his dad/coach, Anatoly Lomachenko, who also coaches another pound-for-pound legend at cruiserweight, who's now up at heavyweight, Alexander Usyk, Lomachenko is just on a totally different program than most of the sport when you see what he's doing in his training sessions. So he is a phenomenal athlete, make no mistake, but he's also a super elite, well-trained, and well-skilled technician. Lomachenko's timing and nuance have his opponents increasingly reluctant to let their hands go. And they become neutered right there in the ring, in plain sight, and just start taking a gradually embarrassing beating. It's incredible. You know, unfortunately, the Lomachenko super fight that I was desperate to see was him versus Mikey Garcia, just after Garcia's return from the 2.5 years spent out of the ring due to a promotional dispute with Bob Arum and Top Rank. I badly wanted to see Lomachenko versus Garcia and have long believed that Garcia has the tools to beat Lomachenko at 135. I wasn't and still am not a huge fan of Garcia's move up to 147. Shoot, I didn't love him fighting Lipinets at 140, but that was doable. But they should have found a way to make Lomachenko versus Garcia around the time that Garcia was beating Robert Easter and was holding multiple belts at 135. Now, I've also long thought that lightweight 135 would be Lomachenko's ceiling physically. He's just not that big a guy. Fighters like Floyd Mayweather, Shane Mosley, and Oscar De La Hoya, who spent their early 20s to mid-20s fighting at 135, eventually fight up at 147 by 30 years and older. Lomachenko was fighting at 126 during his late 20s, which is when he started. He turned pro later than most, as many amateur legends do. So he was at 126 featherweight, a little older, so he doesn't have much more room to grow physically without losing something performance-wise. And that's where this fight gets tricky. See, Lomachenko got caught and dropped in his fight versus former 135-pound champ Jorge Linares. He ended up beating Linares via knockout and has won 3 fights since, 2 of which went the distance versus Jose Pedraza and Luke Campbell, both high-quality opponents, but to my eyes, there does appear to be a slight closing of the skill gap between a now 32-year-old post-2018 shoulder surgery Lomachenko and his elite contemporaries. And Teofimo Lopez certainly qualifies as such. He is, like we mentioned about Mayweather, a young 135, so he's naturally bigger than Loma and will certainly see 140 and maybe 147 in the near future. The problem I expect him to have versus Loma is that while that skill gap I mentioned is closing, it ain't there yet. And although Teo has performed tremendously in his young career, 12 of his 15 wins coming via knockout, some of those highlight reel worthy, he has not faced any opponent in the same solar system as Lomachenko, skill for skill. In fact, aside from Richard Commey and maybe Diego Magdaleno, Lopez hasn't fought any elite or even near elite competition. The one stumble, or near stumble I should say, that Lopez has had was versus largely unknown Masayoshi Nakatani, a much taller fighter whose length gave Teofimo all types of problems, especially through the first half of the fight. Teo did battle back and gutted out a close decision win, but he didn't look spectacular in the least, and he was quick to acknowledge that in the in-ring post-fight interview. He did, however, follow that rough fight up with a sensational knockout of IBF champ Richard Commey for his first major title. Now, there are proven champions, and sometimes there are guys with a belt. Richard Commey earned the vacated IBF title in a win versus Isa Chanayev. I know, I didn't know who he was either. But to Commey's credit, he also did defend it successfully versus Ray Beltran with a knockout. But Commey would certainly be on the lower end of champion or former champion. Nobody considered or considers him best at lightweight. No one thinks of him as someone who will be on any pound-for-pound list anytime soon. He'd also lost a close split decision versus Robert Easter for the vacant IBF belt 4 years prior, so the second time was a charm for him in challenges for a vacant title. Still, Teofimo Lopez becoming the first person to stop an otherwise very tested and durable Richard Commey is a significant accomplishment. This fight versus Lomachenko will be Teo's first title defense of that belt. Now, Teo is an explosive and fast counterpuncher. He has one-punch knockout power, especially in his left hook. What I expect him to run into is not what he ran into versus Nakatani, who was really scaring him with that long right hand, But if you review the tape of Lomachenko and Teofimo Lopez, you'll notice that Lomachenko is the far superior round winner. If you were to break even a single round down to 3 1-minute sub-rounds, you'll realize minute 1, minute 2, and minute 3 almost always each go to Lomachenko. I used to see that with Roy Jones Jr. in the 90s. Floyd did a ton of that as well, where you go several fights without anybody really acknowledging that you lost a round. I'm talking minute by minute domination of the fight. It's the opposite of the feast or famine that became the central theme in some Deontay Wilder fights, especially in his recent ones versus Tyson Fury and Luis Ortiz, and Gerald Washington a bit earlier, where if Wilder isn't scoring a knockdown, it's anyone's guess who won that round. Lomachenko is an exchange by exchange perfectionist where you'll find it difficult to even find a string of 30-second blocks that Loma is losing. Therefore, even in the uneventful rounds, the slow rounds, as online boxing analyst Richard Dwyer here on YouTube likes to call them, even in the rounds where nobody hits the canvas, nobody gets rocked or hit with a lot of big punches, Lomachenko is winning those much more often than not. To baseball fans, he's more Pete Rose, Ichiro Suzuki, Tony Gwynn, Wade Boggs, batting about .330 to .350 with maybe 15 home runs than he is Cecil Fielder or Mark McGwire, where he's hitting 40-plus home runs but batting only .250 with a lot of strikeouts. Lomachenko's activity makes contact and puts the ball in play at all times. And it's then on the opponent to match his chess game move for move. It looks like a psychological disaster for opponents, to be honest, because their weapons at some point are rendered useless. We've seen most Floyd Mayweather opponents encounter that same problem. I think Teofimo has a puncher's chance here, not much else. He has flashy one-punch knockout ability, but move for move, I really think he's outmatched. I see this fight going one of a couple ways. The early rounds are close. Lomachenko does need to be careful. Early, middle, and late. Teo is younger, bigger, and stronger. That presents its own difficulties, of course. They go into the middle rounds and Lomachenko gets into his rhythm, starts picking up his volume. He puts Teo on that treadmill from hell. Teo starts to drown, like most opponents do. He starts looking to land a big shot and a big shot only, but is slowly getting overwhelmed. And this is where things can diverge one of two ways. Teo has the heart of a warrior, takes chances, and is able to complete the duration of the fight and lose via spirited decision. Or he starts getting hit with punches he's no longer seeing, gets frustrated and discouraged, can no longer keep pace with an older Lomachenko, and Teo gets stopped in a late round TKO. We've seen these scenarios between an active legend who's still at or near the top of his game versus a young up-and-coming star who might or might not be holding a belt. In this case, Teo is holding a belt. This might be a little like De La Hoya versus Fernando Vargas, where De La Hoya, who'd been champ at 135, 147, is now up at 154, but is still able to beat the good, young, and supposedly hungrier fighter. Although I do believe Vargas was never quite the same after that Felix Trinidad fight, which was a case of too much too soon versus the most devastating puncher in the sport at the time. Yeah, I think Vargas' career was hurt by fighting Tito, as was Olympic gold medalist David Reeds, as was former middleweight champ William Joppy, among others. Tito Trinidad just did that to people. Lomachenko doesn't have that nightmarish power, but I do see a potential Guillermo Rigondeaux versus Nonito Donaire scenario where the blazing puncher runs into a magician and just leaves the ring beaten and bewildered. And that might or might not have significant ramifications psychologically in the fighter's career going forward. We'll see. And we'll see how this fight plays out in general. I can't wait. But let me know your thoughts on this super fight title unification bout. Again, I think Teofimo had that wonderful knockout of Richard Commey and some others, but Lomachenko is a Jedi Knight in there. We'll see if Teo is able to make his physical and youthful advantages work to his favor. That, coupled with the possibility of landing a mega punch, are his only chance of winning here. Please leave your comments in the comments, like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I'm Woog, thanks for tuning in.